This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. And we are continuing our journey through numerous recorded cycles of the Chopin Mazurkas. We're keeping to pianists who've recorded the standard 51 Mazurkas or who've recorded the additional posthumously published pieces, most of which date from Chopin's youth. Before we continue discussing Chopin Mazurka Cycles, I want to take a moment to mention collections of selected mazurkas by pianists because these collections all play prominent roles within the Chopin Mazurka discography. And we have to start with the most mazurking of all mazurka players, Ignaz Friedman. He recorded a series of 12 mazurkas in September 1930. He also recorded several of these pieces on different occasions earlier on, and there have been alternate takes that have surfaced. But these 1930 sessions, oh my God, Friedman's mazurkas truly mazurk. They just don't sing and dance. They positively soar to the sky. Few pianists have come remotely close to matching Friedman's singular combination of symphonic scope, rhythmic snap, and rustic abandon. And bass lines are strategically timed for maximum lift, and he frequently adds octaves or he fills out chords in the bass. And you remember the catchphrase for Rice Krispie cereal, snap, crackle, and pop? Well, these words perfectly describe Ignaz Friedman's mazurkas. These are just epic performances, and no self-respecting piano maven can be without them. But at the opposite end of Ignaz Friedman, you have Maryla Jonas, who was a Polish pianist, and she was totally unknown and obscure when she made her Carnegie Hall debut in 1946 to a nearly empty house. But she got a rave review in the New York Herald Tribune, and all of a sudden, this shy and reticent pianist turned into an overnight star. And her star eventually faded after a couple of seasons, but she recorded an album of mazurkas that was kind of a holy grail among collectors. Maybe you can call her the anti-Friedman, because she casts a kind of wispy yet very visible shadow on the textures, primarily focusing on shaping melodies. She takes a lot of leeway as far as rubato is concerned, but the rubatos always feel natural and organic. This is Maryla Jonas. And in a similar way, the Mazurka album that Guillermo Novaes recorded for the Vox label in the 1950s is stylistically similar. And also, Ura Guller, the pianist, set down some interesting and sometimes idiosyncratic, yet very personal kinds of mazurka interpretations in the 1950s. Vladimir Horowitz also kept a handful of mazurkas in his repertoire. And in 1949, he set down a whole bunch of them in a recording session in New York's Town Hall. There's always a nervous tension and a neurotic undercurrent to Horowitz and the mazurkas. He always keeps listeners on edge. You have to talk about William Capell because he was working his way through a complete mazurka cycle for RCA Victor. And he never finished it because he was tragically killed in a plane crash in 1953. He recorded about half of the mazurkas, more or less. Interestingly, he apparently took a casual attitude toward the mazurkas, where he'd often play them spontaneously at the end of a recording session if there was time left over, or he'd even sight read a mazurka while the tape was rolling. And there's a lot of poetry and seriousness to his playing, but I often find Capell's mazurkas to sound a little studied and without a lot of variety in the interpretations, which is odd because he did approach them so spontaneously. But I know many piano mavens feel very differently, and they just think of, Capel's Mazurkas as second to none. And they are really wonderful in their way. And also, there are the 10 Mazurkas that Arturo Benedetti Michelangelo recorded for Deutsche Grammophon. I've used the words fire and ice to describe these interpretations, and I'll just leave it at that. Let's see, who else has a good selected Mazurkas collection that I should mention? Oh yes, Clara Min recorded 17 Mazurkas for the Delos label. And she microscopically projects inner voices, and she comes up with these heart-stopping tenutos and outsized dynamics, and sometimes she exaggerates the dotted rhythms, and there are all kinds of interpretive bits of business, but she's very convincing. Also, the pianist Marian Chiapura has a CD that's called Images of a Homeland, and it was released in the year 2000 on the Patria label. I think that may have been his own label. But this disc contains 14 mazurkas in addition to other selections. And I've always enjoyed Marian Chiapura's mazurkas for the subtle give and take of his rubatos and the care he takes with the ornaments and how the phrases just float over the bar lines. It's very idiomatic and really lovely mazurka playing. Also very interesting are the selection of 24 mazurkas that Pavel Kolesnikov has recorded for Hyperion. He's a very multi-leveled interpreter who brings equal amounts of delicacy, poetry, rhythmic firmness, and unabashed virtuosity to these works. And I hope eventually that he will complete all of the mazurkas, because I think that will be one of the most interesting complete cycles if he gets around to it. But let's now go to complete mazurka cycles, continuing what we've talked about over the last 2 episodes. I'm going to start off with a curiosity. Back in 1985, that was 40 years ago, goodness gracious, I was browsing around in the Tower Records Classical Annex on East 4th Street in New York City, where they had a lot of cutouts and budget items. And there was a rack of historic piano cassettes on the label Concert Artists. This was the label started by William Barrington Coop. On this label, he issued about 100 or so CDs allegedly recorded by his wife, the pianist Joyce Hatto. And of course, all of these Joyce Hatto recordings were stolen from recordings by other pianists. I've discussed the Joyce Hatto hoax on an earlier episode. Anyway, among these cheap cassettes on the Concert Artist label was a set of 3 cassettes devoted to the Chopin Mazurkas as played by Alfred Cortot. Now, since I'm a huge Alfred Cortot fan, and back then I was trying to get hold of every Cortot disc I could get my hands on, I was kind of intrigued because I had never seen, let alone heard of, a complete Mazurka cycle listed in any Cortot discography. And at first I thought, well, maybe these were unpublished recordings on his label EMI or HMV, or maybe these were recordings made at the École Normale in Paris where Cortot taught. And I knew that there were some recordings of Cortot playing Beethoven sonatas done at the École Normale, which had not been issued. I think they were rumored. Eventually they did come out, at least some of these. Anyway, I had no clue what these were, but I figured, what the heck. I bought the cassettes, and they were cheap enough, like $2 a cassette. I brought them home, and I listened, and I thought, this is very flaccid and very tentative playing with a real flimsy sonority. It doesn't sound like Cortot to me. It doesn't have the big sound and the virility and the intention of his best Chopin recordings. And I remember when I told my late friend Alan Evans, the record producer and musicologist, about these about these Alfred Cortot Chopin Mazurkas, he also was intrigued and he got hold of the set. And he doubted the authenticity of these recordings from the get-go. Maybe they really were by Joyce Hatto. I don't know. The pianist has never been identified. Eventually, William Barrington Coop brought out these alleged Alfred Cortot Chopin Mazurkas on CDs, and I do have copies of the CDs, but again, who is the pianist? Now, interestingly enough, when EMI, now Warner Classics, brought out their 40-disc box set of the complete Alfred Cortot, there were 2 mazurkas included, and all it said was that they were recorded in 1950. I was a little suspicious, so I played these, and sure enough, these were recordings that were absolutely identical to the same performances on those concert hall discs. But again, were they really Cortot? I doubt it, but someone may know better than I do. I mean, I have no idea. However, among out-of-print Mazurka cycles that are not just authentic, but totally desirable, I want to mention recordings by Karen Kushner on the Connoisseur Society label. I don't remember when she recorded these, but the sonics are wonderful, and her playing is eloquence personified. She brings so much depth and intelligence to her interpretations. So if you ever see the Karen Kushner Chopin Mazurka Cycle on Connoisseur Society, grab it without hesitation. Edel Barrett recorded all of the mazurkas as part of her Chopin piano music cycle on Naxos. The sonics aren't the greatest, and sometimes her rubatos can be coy or mannered, but I just like the fact that she plays with the music, and she always holds your attention. Now, if you can find it, Vasily Primakov recorded all of the mazurkas for his own LP label. He had recorded a selection of 21 mazurkas for bridge previously. Some of these I enjoyed, but some I found kind of perverse or willful. Anyway, he recorded the whole kit and caboodle in 2014 for his own label. And by then, he had become a more decisive interpreter with more variety of dynamic contrasts. And sometimes his phrase taperings or his slight hesitancies before reaching a climax still strike me as being coy or mannered, but Primakov's best performances really do stand the test of time. I like this Mazurka cycle quite a lot. However, you get equal subjectivity but more consistency from the Mazurka cycle by Dmitry Alexiev. This came out on the Frederick Chopin Institute's label not long after they brought out the Adam Horovatsic cycle that I talked about on our first Mazurka episode. Grab the Dmitry Alexiev Mazurka cycle if you can find it. Unfortunately, Steinway and Sons withdrew Miriam Conti's marvelous Mazurka cycle for their label, most likely because she decamped over to Yamaha. Now, she recorded these Mazurkas in the Bronx studio owned and operated by my dear and late friend, Joseph Patridge. And I reviewed this set for ClassicsToday.com, so I thought I would just read a little bit of my review. I wrote that, fusing intellect and instinct, Miriam Conti clearly has thought these amazingly inventive and diverse pieces through insofar as tempi, tone color, voicings, and ornamentation are concerned. I'll cite one cogent example. Conti begins the C-sharp minor, opus 33, number 1's unaccompanied modal melody in an unusually soft and off-handed manner. But once the left hand enters, the pianist increases intensity, not so much in volume as by way of subtle legato phrasing, where notes seem to overlap by a split second, as if attempting to make the piano notes slide into one another in the manner of a singer. So do try to find Miriam Conti's Chopin Mazurka Cycle. You will be glad that you did. Janina Fialkowska's 2008 and 2011 all Chopin recital discs for the Atma Klassik label included a total of 7 mazurkas in highly distinctive and original interpretations that boded well for a comprehensive mazurka survey from this pianist. And sure enough, my prayers were answered when Fialkowska recorded the entire Mazurka cycle in 2012 and 2013, including new versions of the aforementioned 7 pieces. Her conceptions often recall her mentor, Arthur Rubinstein's late-period mazurka playing in regard to lyrical breadth, a thoroughly internalized sense of rubato, and an ability to savor felicitous details without exaggeration or overly lingering. For example, check out Fialkowska's rumination over Opus 24, No. 4's contrapuntal layers, or Opus 50, No. 3's finely tuned modulations. You sense that Janina Fialkowska has lived with and thought about these works for a very long time before setting them down for posterity. The engineering is excellent, and Fialkowska also contributed her own really perceptive and insightful annotations, so her Mazurka cycle is definitely a keeper. I talked about some eccentric mazurkers on the previous episode, and so now I have to talk about Jean-Marc Luisada. Yes, I know he's been a great mentor for certain young pianists who've been participating in the Chopin competition. Apparently, he learned most of the repertoire for his 1992 Deutsche Grammophon recordings of the Mazurkas with only 2 months' notice. But that's neither here or there because he signed off on the project. In any event, he focuses more on nuts, bolts, and sundry details than the proverbial big picture or general pulse of a piece, and he seems to favor complexity over simplicity. For example, in the DG recordings, Luisada subjects the 4 Opus 67 mazurkas to microscopic variations of articulation and voicing. He stretches the Opus 7 No. 1 B-flat mazurka's trills to dangerous boundaries, and he underlines Opus 63 No. 3's canon through dynamic extremes and playing the lines ever so slightly out of sync. It's not very subtle playing. But, these are quirky, but they're not uninteresting interpretations. And for this cycle on DG, he only played the mazurkas with opus numbers, and he left out the Émile Gaillard and the Notre Dame pieces in A minor. Luisada, by the way, re-recorded the mazurkas for RCA in 2008, and I imagine this time he didn't have a 2-month deadline. But the remakes basically follow the earlier interpretation's hyper-detailed game plan, with more left-hand anticipations and more blurred pedalings this time around. And for whatever reason, Luisada did not record Opus 68 No. 4 for RCA. Anyway, he's another pianist whose mazurkas are best sampled in small doses. There's a cycle I forgot to mention that is quite interesting, speaking of quirky and subjective, and it features the Polish pianist Andrzej Wasowski, who lived from 1919 until 1993. In January 1981, he gave a concert at New York City's Alice Tully Hall where he played the entire cycle of mazurkas in concert. Had anyone done that before in New York City? I have no idea. But his 1980 studio recordings of the cycle reveal a very subjective and free approach, as if the pianist was in a constantly exploratory mood. He likes broad tempos and he likes introspection. He likes to savor felicitous turns of harmony and melody. Yet somehow I never find my attention wandering, nor do I grow impatient. And I really feel that Wasowski is sincere. I don't get the feeling of contrivance that I hear from Jean-Marc Louis-Sada. Not that there's anything wrong with contrivance, but there's more of an inner flow and continuity with Wasowski. Perhaps a loose continuity, if you will. You know what I mean. Now, one of my very, very favorite Mazurka cycles was recorded, I think, in 1988, featuring the late, great Brazilian pianist Antonio Barbosa Lima. He actually had recorded the Mazurkas before on a small Brazilian label in 1983, but these are all but impossible to find, and besides, the sound quality is kind of dry, so you're not really missing anything. But the 1988 recordings on Centaur are the ones to have, and they feature mazurka playing with great exuberance, great spontaneity, lots of color, lots of imagination, rhythmic elan. I mean, this is everything you can possibly want in a mazurka player. You just cannot miss this cycle. And it would be my overall first choice, but, however, there is a mazurka cycle that's just a little bit more consistent and steady, yet no less stimulating and personal. And if I was forced to choose just one Chopin Mazurka cycle from the many versions I've been discussing, I would pick the one by Garrick Olson. It first appeared on Arabesque, and it was reissued on Hyperion as part of this pianist's complete Chopin piano works cycle for that label. So what makes Garrick Olson's mazurkas stand out from the crowd? What makes them so special? I think he strikes an ideal balance between Rubinstein's thoughtfulness and Horowitz's nervous energy, with a light and transparent and even airy touch that brings out the skittish and playful qualities one often finds in the mazurkas. Garrick Olson pays attention to the subtle modulations and inner voices by illuminating them, but without belaboring the obvious. And he finds just the right fusion of old school and modern Chopin styles. And I always hear something new every time I return to these performances. So although there never can be just one way to play the Chopin mazurkas, I think you will be rewarded by making Garrick Olson your point of entry. And then from there, of course, you can explore all of these many other versions of Chopin's mazurkas to your heart's content. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. And we have some more Chopin recordings to talk about on upcoming episodes, so please join me for those. Take good care, and thank you for listening.